Hello, my name is Kiran Joni. This is the second part of the seventh session. Here, we will continue our discussion on effectual self-organization. So, as I already introduced, the dynamics of self-organization can be understood in terms of four keystone dynamical features or constraints. They are dispositionality, adjacent possible, co-evolutionary dynamics, and emergent and evolving reality, or new disposition, which enable a system to exhibit adaptive behaviors that arise from the interactions between its components. It is from this foundation that the idea of effectual self-organization was developed. So let us go through the logic behind the development of effectual self-organization. The first key point to understand is that my goal is to design for self-organized solution finding for the domain of entrepreneurship, which was inspired by the constraints-led approach in sports coaching, as I already mentioned. So constraints-led approach is a sports coaching approach developed based on self-organization theory as its core foundation. When I discovered this approach, I wanted to bring this thinking to the domain of entrepreneurship. I also discovered that applied complexity models that use the idea of self-organization is getting a lot of attention from scholarly community. So I thought there is a possibility of doing exactly what I imagined. This was the beginning of my effort. The problem is that because of ill-structured nature of the domain of entrepreneurship, I cannot directly apply the constraint-led approach to the domain of entrepreneurship. In the case of sports, there generally exists some kind of structural constraint that limits infinite possibilities. For example, a football ground limits the geographical boundary. No matter what level of complexity happens, all kinds of dynamics will happen within the boundary of that football ground. There are also rules and regulations that further constrains the behavior of the players. So this is not the case when it comes to the domain of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship can be seen as ill-structured or unstructured complexity domain. There are infinite number of possibilities. Nobody is going to restrict or put limitations. There is no goal stability. Goals also evolve and co-evolve. There is no state space stability. Today, I might be operating in a local market. Tomorrow, I might be operating in a kind of national level market. Further, entrepreneurship is a social system. So technology-enabled global adjacent possible is a possibility. Knowledge and perception asymmetry regarding the available affordances in the adjacent possible is a key issue in the case of the domain of entrepreneurship. We already discussed the idea of adjacent possible. It is important to understand that adjacent possible in a complex self-organizing system involves unprestatable, open-ended becoming. So we cannot predict what is going to happen next. Even if it is a case of a structured complexity domain like a game situation, we cannot predict what is going to happen next. Even in that case, not only do we not know what will happen, we do not even know what can happen in the case of an ill-structured complexity domain like entrepreneurship. Because of this level of uncertainty, external agents like people, institutions will try to affect our autonomy, resulting in a kind of agency hijack. So this is a serious issue. So as we just observed, the agency and autonomy hijacking potential is high in a social complexity domain like entrepreneurship. Autonomy refers to the absence of external control. A system needs to organize without interference from outside. As I already discussed in the second video, prescriptive models like the lean startup is a kind of attempt to hijack the autonomy or agency of the entrepreneur. This is a serious issue and this must be kept in mind. With regard to this issue with agency and autonomy, it is important to understand that self-organization in human social domains like entrepreneurship have some key issues. There are asymmetric power relations. Secondly, social domains like entrepreneurship are full of decontextualized advice, one-size-fits-all models, rigid prescriptions, etc. Starting from the local level, people will start to influence our judgment based on their own anecdotal theories and cliche advice. Secondly, it is important to stress on the autonomy principle of self-organizing systems. Autonomy can be talked about as absence of external control. A system needs to organize without interference from outside. Autonomy does not mean that the system can have no input at all. Input is possible and important as long as the inputs are no control instructions from outside the system. The decision on what to do next should be made completely from inside the system. So that's a key point of autonomy. And it is important to maintain this level of autonomy to facilitate self-organization. Without autonomy, maintenance of autonomy, self-organization will not happen. This problem of agency and autonomy hijacking is a serious issue. As I was thinking and reflecting on this issue, I thought about the possibility of introducing a primary constraint that removes any possibility of external agents from taking over the agency of the entrepreneur. So I was thinking about the possibility of solving this issue through introducing a simple flexible heuristics or constraint, a primary constraint that enables the system to stick on to the self-organization dynamics instead of being hijacked by an external agent. So that is why I'm introducing here a flexible list of intermediary heuristics or constraints. As we already discussed, we identified 4 key dynamical features in a complex self-organizing system. We can explain the self-organization behavior using this 4 keystone dynamical features. This is true whether it is the case of a termite's nest, whether it is the dynamics of a beehive, whether it is people walking in a street, not bumping into each other, coordinating with each other without even knowing it, whether it is the case of a weaver ant coordinating with each other, whether it is the case of bird murmuration, or whether it is the dynamics of a market. All of these systems behave according to the fundamental primary constraints, that is dispositionality, adjacent possible, coevolutionary dynamics, emergent and evolving reality. So because of this reason, I developed the simple flexible heuristics based on this primary constraint. So for example, dispositionality will become the heuristic that is understand your current dispositional propensity. The second keystone dynamical constraint is adjacent possible. So the heuristic will be act in the adjacent possible. Coevolutionary dynamics will become make use of the coevolutionary potential of other systems. And the fourth one is emergent and evolving reality. Accept and leverage the emergent and evolving reality. Don't cry about it. Whatever is current reality, that's the only place you can take action. The fifth key dimension I want to discuss is effectuation theory and the similarity with self-organization dynamics. Now, I was exploring 3 things simultaneously because I was very much interested in learning science, education, etc. I got exposed to the constraints-led approach. And I was very much impressed by this approach because it is based on fundamental science. It is based on natural science. It is taking fundamental natural science and applying that to the domain of sports. So I was thinking about the possibility of taking this idea and applying this to the domain of entrepreneurship. That was one of my key curiosities. Secondly, I was exploring the nature of self-organization because I thought self-organization is a ubiquitous feature in open complex adaptive systems. I was simultaneously exploring theoretical foundations of self-organization. I also got exposed to approaches like guided self-organization, synergetics, etc., which are matured applied complexity and applied self-organization approaches. Thirdly, I was exploring effectuation theory. I was very much impressed by the effectuation theory, but the problem was that because of my curiosity, I started to explore this approach and found several limitations in this theory. Because I have a background and interest in learning science and education, I was also passionate about the idea of expertise, skill acquisition, etc. This made me extremely critical of effectuation's core assumptions because of theoretical issues. I identified several serious issues. The problem is that even with the above discussed issues, practically effectuation made enormous sense. There is something intuitive about effectuation that bugged me about trashing it completely. This was when I discovered a quote from Saraswati attributed to Herbert Simon. That is, according to Herbert Simon, near decomposability is an astonishingly ubiquitous principle in the architecture of rapidly evolving complex systems. And effectuation appears to be a preferred decision model with entrepreneurs who have created high growth firms. So according to Herbert Simon, we should be able to link near decomposability to the process these entrepreneurs use to create and grow enduring firms, whether in an experimental situation or in real world. This quote sparked in me an urge to look simultaneously at the effectuation theory and self-organization dynamics. The reason being that the near decomposable systems are, generally speaking, complex adaptive systems with self-organization tendencies. What near decomposability means that it is far from equilibrium system. It runs away from equilibrium. Equilibrium is death. It operates in the edge of chaos too. So it is far from equilibrium, edge of chaos system. So in the middle zone system. Because of this particular code, I thought about comparing effectuation theory with the simple flexible heuristics or primary constraints that I identified in my analysis of self-organizing systems. So when I started looking at the principles of effectuation simultaneously with the simple rules or primary constraints that I identified in complex self-organizing systems, I found a lot of similarity between these two systems. As suggested by Herbert Simon, when we compare these two approaches, the primary constraints that I discussed earlier with the principles of effectuation theory, we see a lot of similarity here. So let us have a look into some of the possible relations. Let us have a look into the bird-in-hand principle. The bird-in-hand principle suggests to start with your means without waiting for the perfect opportunity. Entrepreneurs should take action based on what they have readily available, by asking the question who you are, what you have, who you know, etc. The idea of understanding your current dispositional propensity, in my case, was inspired by Dave Snowden, who used the term dispositional mapping to indicate the importance of trying to figure out the current dispositional propensity of the system to enable the agent to make use of the current dispositional propensity to take action. So there is some relation. I'm not saying that this is exactly the same, but if you look into the fundamental level, this makes sense. Bird-in-hand principle, whether it is the case of entrepreneurship, whether it is a case of bird murmuration, the current dispositional propensity is the only thing we can know in a complex self-organizing system. The second key heuristics identified, or primary constraint identified, is act in the adjacent possible. Adjacent possible, as I already identified, is a concept developed by Stuart Kaufman. I'm not saying it is exactly the same as affordable loss principle, but there might be some relation. The second key principle of acting in the adjacent possible can also be related to the first bird-in-hand principle. Bird-in-hand principle suggests taking action immediately in the possible space. So that we might be able to explain based on this adjacent possible principle. The affordable loss principle can be seen as an enabling constraint that enables or facilitate the action in the adjacent possible than worrying about impossible things. The third key point is the coevolutionary, making use of the coevolutionary potential of other systems, people, things, artifacts, agents, institutions, etc. So whatever it is, the current coevolutionary potential, we make use of that to take action. So here, self-organizing entrepreneurs make use of the coevolutionary potential of other systems, agents, and things. This is not conceived as an imposing top-down order, but a distributed coevolutionary and co-adaptive process that makes use of the inherent intelligence of complex adaptive systems. The entrepreneur influences the evolution of others, they are in turn influenced by others. As I already discussed earlier, coevolution here in this framework is used in a wider perspective, inclusive of micro manifestations like co-adaptation, cooperation, co-creation, co-dynamics, etc. Co-dynamics might be the co-dynamics between a tool and a tool user, for example. It is important to note that the coevolutionary potential in this framework is envisioned as having a much bigger scope than the one conceived by Saraswati's effectuation theory. The crazy quilt principle in effectuation is thus viewed as only one among many ways to enact the coevolutionary dynamics. While the crazy quilt in effectuation is limited to stakeholders, the co-evolutionary dynamics extends to all systems, including human, social, cognitive, material. This includes ideas, artifacts, tools, etc. We can use a toolbox analogy to explain this idea. Entrepreneur is not driven by tools like lean startup or business model canvas. Instead, he or she chooses or co-evolves appropriate tools depending on emergent needs. So this is about making use of the co-evolutionary potential of the present. So if the problem is to remove a screw, we'll be looking for a screwdriver, but if it is not possible to find a screwdriver, we'll be using some other sharp tools to remove the screw. So in real world, there is no exact purpose tools. There are emergent problems, and we might be looking around to find tools to solve this problem. And we might use whatever it is in our possession to solve this problem. He might not be optimizing in this regard. For example, chair is a tool built to sit in comfort. But in the case of a brawl, we can use it as a tool to beat somebody else. In the case of a weaver ant, when they want to travel, they want to cross a path, they make a bridge out of their own body. So it's a kind of co-evolutionary dynamics in its micro manifestations that we see in all these systems. It's an adaptive behavior. It's part of the self-organization phenomena. Now, for the enactment of co-evolution in all these levels, I use American pragmatist John Dewey's instrumentalism, which I term here as co-evolutionary instrumentalism. John Dewey distinguished his philosophy from earlier philosophical pragmatists by calling his version as instrumentalism, which indicated that knowledge, things, artifacts, tools, language, cognition, etc. are instruments that we use to act in the world. His instrumentalism was primarily inspired by evolutionary theory. Now, according to Dewey, the entire significance of evolutionary method in biology and social history is that every single organ, structure, or formation, every group of cells or elements have to be treated as an instrument of adjustment or adaptation to a particular environing situation. Its meaning, character, its value is known when and only when it is considered as an arrangement for meeting the conditions involved in specific situation. The situation decides, the emergent situation decides what kind of tools we use. Firstly, the good thing about bringing this idea of co-evolutionary instrumentalism to the domain of entrepreneurship is that it removes the conflict between instruments. Like a carpenter using his tool, all instruments are considered useful and complementary. Using one doesn't mean that you have to sacrifice another one. For example, there is no conflict in this model between business planning and lean startup and effectuation and bricolage. All of these are tools in a toolbox. Since there is no conflict between these instruments, there is no possibility of having a conversation to exclude ideas, exclude possibilities. So we can use other people to do things. We can use tools to do things like, for example, Gmail, ERP softwares, web hosting platforms. We can also use simple heuristics, ad hocism, effectuation, bricolage, experimentation, improvisation. We can also simultaneously use business planning, contingency planning, effectuation theory, design thinking, etc. There is no conflict between these tools. All of these tools are useful. All of these are complementary. None of these tools are in conflict with each other. So the idea of co-evolutionary instrumentalism solves the problem of conflict between these instruments. So that debate is ended. The conflict between tools is a solved debate. Second key point to understand is that co-evolutionary instrumentalism is bidirectional. Stuart Kaufman once observed that all evolution is really co-evolution. The agent can use artifacts or tools. The artifacts and tools will also influence the agent. So that's the idea of bidirectionality of instrumentalism. The instrument is also affecting us. We are also affecting instruments. The agents and the instruments, both are affected by the environment, other forces around the environment. That's the key idea of the co-evolutionary nature of instrumentalism. It is also important to note that design scholars use the concept of instrumental genesis to account for this idea of mutual evolution of artifacts and their uses for specific purposes in specific environments. This means that a tool or instrument that was explicitly designed for a unique purpose in the past can be used for a radically new purpose. Thirdly, co-evolutionary instrumentalism has exaptive property. Exaptation or Darwinian pre-adaptation refers to biological or social characters evolved for other uses and later co-opted for their current role. This means that a tool or instrument that we explicitly designed for a unique purpose in the past can be used for a radically new purpose. Since every context is unique and emergent, every use of an instrument is actually exaptive in nature. So this is very close to the idea of instrumental genesis that was used by the design scholars to explain more or less the same idea. Now, to conclude, this solves a lot of problems in the domain of entrepreneurship. There is no need for long debates to promote a particular model instead of another one. No matter how much we try, because the system we are talking about is a complex self-organizing system that operates with the fundamentals of evolutionary dynamics. It has an inherent tendency to select appropriate tools and models instead of being prescribed by a top-down order. So here, it almost rhymes a Marxian slogan, from each according to its popularity or status to each according to its ecological use value. So this has been a long introduction to the idea of coevolutionary dimension. The next key principle in effectuation theory is lemonade principle. The lemonade principle in effectuation is about leveraging contingencies and embracing surprises that arise from uncertain situations, and also remaining flexible rather than fixated to the existing goals. Even though this is not exactly the same as emergent and evolving reality, there is clearly a connection between these two ideas. So what Saraswati calls an uncertain situation here can be seen as an emergent situation. An unexpected emergent property might show up, or maybe we might see it as a negative thing. We might see it as not useful at a particular point. But it is important to accept this reality and make use of the current dispositional propensity. That's a key point. As I already discussed, in nature, systems don't cry about unexpected things. They have to adapt to whatever uncertain situation that was given to them, no matter what it is. Now, as I already discussed, the emergent and evolving reality will become the current dispositional reality or current dispositional propensity. The next key point in effectuation theory is pilot in the plane principle. It stresses on the idea that entrepreneurs can deliberately choose to apply the 4 principles identified beforehand. That is the bird in hand principle, affordable loss principle, crazy quilt principle, the lemonade principle, and shape the future of the venture. As I already discussed, in nature, all of these 4 principles that I identified, that is dispositional propensity, adjacent possible, co-evolutionary dynamics, and emergent and evolving reality, all of these are simultaneously happening. So this can be equated to this idea that it is already happening in nature. Nobody is prescribing them to do this. There is no effectuation theory in nature, but in nature, we can see this pattern all the time. It is not the same. It is an equivalent to the idea of pilot in the plane principle. And the final principle is effectual cycle. The effectual cycle is a dynamical process that allows entrepreneurs to continuously adapt and evolve their approach based on feedback and changing circumstances. As I already discussed, the emergent and evolving reality will become the current dispositional reality in this case. There is also similarity between these two ideas. The difference here might be that I don't see this as a cycle. I see this as a non-linear dynamical process. All of these 4 dynamical features are simultaneously happening all the time. So the key difference is that what I propose here is based on natural science and self-organization theory, and what Saraswati proposes is based on cognitive science and also proposes it as an expertise theory. Now, it is important to note that I named this symbol flexible heuristics as effectual self-organization because of this similarity with effectuation theory. It is also important to note that effectual self-organization should be seen primarily as a reminder that you are already a complex adaptive self-organizing system. It shouldn't be directly prima facie considered as a prescriptive model. It is not primarily a prescription. The second key point to remember is about the primary constraint. That is, act like self-organizing systems. Before going to the specific, the big picture is that you are already a self-organizing system. So act like self-organizing system. Do not always behave according to the dictums of top-down order or prescription. Thirdly, but lastly, follow the simple flexible heuristics. Understand your current dispositional propensity, act in the adjacent possible, make use of the coevolutionary potential of other systems, leverage emergent and evolving reality, accept and leverage emergent and evolving reality. Then emergent and evolving reality will become the current dispositional reality. This is the final articulation of effectual self-organization. Primary, it is a reminder. Secondly, before going to the specifics, it is about the big picture or primary constraint, that is act like self-organizing system. You're already a self-organizing system. And thirdly, it's about using this primary dynamical constraints. So to conclude this session, first of all, entrepreneurship is a complex domain. Secondly, open complex systems have self-organization tendencies. Thirdly, designing for self-organization works based on large number of evidence. Fourthly, self-organization happens under the primary constraints of 4 keystone dynamical features. They are dispositionality, adjacent possible, coevolutionary dynamic, and emergent and evolving reality. Based on this 4 keystone constraints, a simple flexible heuristics or primary constraint is developed called the effectual self-organization. So effectual self-organization is the primary constraint. So in the next session, we will be discussing deeply about the idea of constraints itself. And we'll be discussing the fundamental nature of constraints in complex systems. So that's the end of this session. See you soon in the next session.